Policies shape every aspect of society, from education, healthcare, the economy, and so much more. However, for so many, policy making remains a mystery. Welcome to the first episode of a new season of the Leading Woman Show Policy Series, brought to you by the National Endowment for Democracy and Luminate. Nigeria's complex multicultural landscape presents unique challenges. For policies to address these issues, citizens must be informed and actively involved. This is why demystifying policy is not just important, but essential for sustainable development. In this season, we will take a close look at policies and all the ways they affect and impact the lives of Nigerians. We will highlight how inclusive leadership can deliver benefits for every Nigerian with the single goal of ensuring that policy is not only demystified, but also engaged with. I'm your host, Abosede Jojogan, and today we discuss demystifying policy with two guests, Professor Funmi Haram Malam, MNI. She's the Director of Studies at the National Institute of Policy and Strategic Studies, Kuru, Plateau State, Nigeria. Our next guest is Amara Nwampa, a global public policy expert known for leading impactful advocacy projects. He is the Director, Partnerships and Development at the Shehu Musa Yaradua Foundation, and he specializes in evidence-driven policy and participatory governance. Let's begin this conversation. So welcome, Professor Funmi and Amara. Really delighted to have you here. And I don't mean to put you under pressure, but this is the first episode of the third season. So you have the, should I say, the task of helping us demystify policy. That's our topic for today. So, Professor Funmi, assume that the people who are going to listen to this, our audience, don't know anything. What is policy?
Well, policy is actually decision making, but specialized decision making. We all make decisions, which means at different levels, whether at the level of the family, communities, and everything. If organizations and groups, we make policies. So a lot of people think that policy is just about what government does, but policy is, for example, just a set of rules and guidelines and plans that tell people what to do in a specific area towards achieving a specific goal.
Right.
You know, especially like trying to solve social problems and trying to create public value. So essentially policy is about creating public value. It's also about trying to make sure that you deliver goods and services to the people, because that's the process by which you do that. Government, you know, has a vision, has a goal, has some outcomes it wants to achieve, most likely or hopefully for the people, but not always. And so you have this statement of intent, an official statement of intent that is backed by strategies on how you want to achieve that goal, those objectives.
Yes.
And it should be these goals and objectives should be collectively agreed by society.
Right.
You know, so everybody should be able to input into the policy making process. And I also need to say that, you know, policy, particularly when it's done by government, it has to have an overarching goal of producing national development and aligning national development goals with our overarching strategic national interest, so that we are globally competitive, so that among the nations of the world, Nigeria does stand out. That is a function of your domestic policy.
Yes.
The extent to which you're able to compete with other countries is a function of your domestic policy.
Interesting. So, Amara, if you were to explain what policy is to my 9-year-old daughter, how would you define it?
Well, I would agree with Prof here. Policy is an articulation of a collective roadmap towards a desired outcome. So when collectively we've identified a desirable outcome, we collectively agree how are we going to get there together. Then we put it down, we articulate it, and that's what policy is. And that process could be technical, but it
could be simple, or not at all.
It could be simple, and I have to probably break it down a bit more, because the conceptual models of how the policy process, agenda setting, which is how do we identify a problem?
Yes.
How do we prioritize problems? Because there's so many problems.
Indeed.
But what is the priority for us, and what should we be focused on right now? That's a stage in policy making. There's also the policy formulation, which is looking at what is the solution and what possible pathways do we have between this problem and our desired outcome. There is the policy adoption process,
right,
which is how do we adopt this solution now as something that we're doing. So the proposal is presented, maybe it's to Parliament or to a government official who has the power to sign off on that policy. And then that's the adoption process. Then, of course, there's implementation. And you're smiling because a lot of times people say that this is where we fall short.
Indeed.
But there's also another step, it's evaluation. We need to look at this policy and say, are we really headed in this direction? Remember, it's a roadmap. Are we headed in that direction? So you don't wait until the policy runs out before you evaluate. It's a continuous process. And, these stages I've talked about are not necessarily serial or sequential.
Right.
Many of them can be happening at the same time.
Right.
Sometimes they don't necessarily even have to follow each other. But these are all the things that are happening if policy is being developed.
Yes. And I guess that's what makes it technical. But to your point, if these different stages are simplified, then it becomes a simplified process.
Yeah.
But it does take multiple elements to get to the end. Why is policy such a mystery? What is this thing that is shrouding policy and how people interpret it?
Well, I guess it's because policy is mystified to most Nigerians, because a lot of people are excluded from the process. A lot of people feel alienated from what's going on within the corridors of government. So people feel marginalized from the process, in the sense that in Nigeria today, we really don't have what you call a broadly consultative policy process.
Right.
And then a lot of people don't understand what the process is all about. And actually, it is quite a complex process. And it hasn't been broken down into its simplified parts. Another reason is because we operate a federal system. And people are supposed to be actively involved in policy making at the local government level. But hardly anybody, if you take a sample from your audience, for example, you find that hardly anybody is really actively involved in making policies, implementing policies, even within their local government areas.
Right.
But all of us belong to local government areas, and we should really be involved. So I think this is one of the reasons. And of course, there's not a lot of transparency when it comes to the way government works.
Right.
We don't have a situation where policies are actively made public. And in a society where there's not much digitization, people can easily, oftentimes, access policies online. Although that's becoming increasingly more doable now.
Yes.
But I think that's one of the reasons why it's also...
Why it's shrouded. Fantastic. Amara, what would you say? Why is policy... I mean, both of you, you're policy experts. And how did you become an expert on something that is so mysterious to many?
Well, I would say that it was interest-driven. But a couple of reasons why policy remains a mystery is, first of all, there are misconceptions about policy development. Many people outsource policy development and think, okay, well, this is a decision to be made by big people or in government. And therefore, since I'm not the one making the decision, I shouldn't be involved in the process. There's also lack of transparency. The process is sometimes designed to be mysterious, to take inputs or to inform the least amount of people possible, especially people who are going to be most affected by the policy. So we have situations where people's heads are being shaved in their absence. There's also the fact that it could also be very technical as well, and therefore it turns people off, because you hear all this jargon and very technical language, and you're like, I don't want to bother with that. But there's also the sense of resignation as well, because people have been involved in policy making, and then you find that a lot of times these policies haven't turned into anything realistic or delivered the outputs, and therefore people are naturally disconnected from the process.
Yes. Prof, what are the key challenges in the policy landscape in Nigeria? If you just think about it, and Amara started to allude to the point that we're not lacking policies in this country, you know what I mean? But where really it falls short is implementation. But what are the key challenges if you think about policy in the Nigerian landscape?
Okay, so well, first, let me just speak to something Amara said. I like the fact that he used the word roadmap. And you were talking about your 9-year-old daughter.
Yes.
So if you think of policy as a roadmap,
Yes.
then that means you're looking at policy as a travel guide. So a travel guide,
map.
exactly,
Yes.
it shows you how to get from point A
right
up to the point where you want to go.
Yes.
So that's a really good image and a good way of depicting policy, because then everybody can key in to say,
True.
okay, this is where we are, this is where we want to be as a
Yes.
country or as a community,
Yes.
and this is how we want to get from where we are
So
to where we want to be. That is the strategies, the how to.
Yes.
So essentially to a 9-year-old,
Yes,
that
will make a lot of
really
sense.
make a lot of sense
Yes.
about what policy is. Okay, so now to the challenges. The challenges facing the public policy making process in Nigeria are numerous, and they are quite complex. And I will categorize them into 4 areas.
Yes.
So you have political, economic, institutional, and sociocultural.
Right.
So from the political aspect, there's a lot of political interference in the process and political instability. Now, interference in the sense that it's important. Let's all know that public policy is a political process in itself.
Yes.
It's politics.
Whether it's done in private sector, public, wherever.
It's a
Even in
political
the family.
process, yes, because it's about how power is used.
Yes.
And how you use power to allocate resources.
Yes.
That's essentially what it's about. So it would definitely be a political process. But there's a difference between politicking and politricking. So when political...
You have to tell us the difference.
Well, you see,
okay.
when you have the elite interfering with the process to suit their ends, so that public policy now becomes based on elite interest instead of public interest,
Right.
then that is political interference. That's politricking. And then you also have the issue of political instability. Instability in the sense that, in a federal system, like Amara said, there are multiple pieces to the process. You have multi-layer levels of engagement in the process, and horizontally of different ministries, departments, and agencies, and different arms of government all involved. So that's complicated in itself. Now, when that complexity is mixed with instability, whereby you have frequent regime change, and then you have party interests overriding national interests. So, for example, one party takes over from another party and just sweeps away all the policies that the previous government did. So you have policy somersault, you have policy confusion, just policy abortion, I would even say, because policies get aborted midway. They're not allowed to, go to their logical conclusion. So that's the political aspect. Then when you look at the economic aspect, you look at the fact that more often than not, policies are not well resourced. So the kind of public funding that is required to ensure that the policies are properly implemented is often lacking. And that goes down to the fact that we don't have a very strong industrial base So we rely so much on oil revenue.
Right.
And the volatility of foreign exchange and all of that means that government is often cash strapped. Then our tax administration system is severely dysfunctional because, you know, the only tax that we really get is from the formal sector.
Right.
And the huge informal economy has not yet been brought into the tax net.
Yeah.
So public funding available to resource policies is severely lacking. So on the economic level, attached to the economic level, I bring to the attention of the audience our institutional weakness. You know, Nigeria, when it comes to public institutions, very often the institutional capability to actually design and implement policies is not there. First and foremost, research and analysis must inform all policy decisions.
That's right.
We don't do enough research. So we don't really have evidence-based policies. And it is evidence-based policies that will address the realities and the needs of Nigerians.
That's true.
Because where do you get that research from? You have to get it from Nigerians. Where do you conduct the research among Nigerians?
Yes.
Nigerians are the target beneficiaries. And then you have to gather enough statistics that speaks to the lives of Nigerians. And when that is absent, then the decisions will be faulty, ab initio. So it's not just the implementation, it's also the crafting, the design of the policies.
Yes.
When you don't have adequate evidence informing that design process. And then the fact that, okay, we talked about lack of resources, right? Yeah. Institutionally, we also have severe leakage. And that is where you have funds that, even the little funds we have are misappropriated.
That's right.
Okay? So people are just dipping their hands into the pie, money that is meant for delivering public services. In fact, somebody joked and said, Nigeria, they will allocate money for something. 90% will go into private hands. Only 10% gets to actually, you know, be used for the delivery, the design and delivery of policies. So, finally, the socio-cultural level.
Yes.
There's a lot of resistance from the public to public policies. One, because of low public trust. And why do we have low public trust? It's often informed by our ethno-religious tensions. Remember the Ruga saga? Yeah. Where government wanted to bring this Ruga, and everybody said, no, people didn't trust what government was doing and all of that. And that's, you know, in virtually every sphere. Yeah. So public distrust and and ethno-religious tensions.
Wow, that was a comprehensive masterclass. So give her a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
I'm going to come back to you, but let's take a quick break and we'll be right back to continue this conversation. Welcome back. We're still discussing demystifying policy with our guests. So, Amara, before we went on a break, you know, Prof had just given us a masterclass, but what would you add to that in terms of the challenges of the policy landscape here in Nigeria?
Well, Prof is a very difficult act to follow. But I would say that I'll call it elite capture. The policy space in Nigeria is heavily elite driven and elite focused as well. And what that does is that the needs and the interests of elites get to be reflected in the policy design and the policy, what has been chosen and so on and so forth. And that's a huge problem because policies are meant to address public problems. But when you have policy design that is driven by narrow interests, then it now becomes a challenge of fitting the resulting policy into the context of the problem itself. So we find that solutions that are designed for certain things, we're now trying to manage and work around it to make it work for the masses. Whereas we could have designed it from the ground up to work for the general public.
And just sort of following off of that, then how do citizens then get involved in this policy-making process? If you say it has been captured, how can they, you know, and maybe that's where the mistrust comes from that you spoke about earlier, but what would you say? How do citizens get involved in the policy-making process?
Well, I will start by explaining the process a bit, because maybe if you understand the process, you know where you come in. Because a lot of times when we talk about policy making, there's already a certain consensus on ground. So we're talking about how policies change.
Yes.
Because there's already a way in which we were doing things before, and now we want to change it. Maybe it has to do with how we were procuring rice, like rice imports, and now we want to change that to ban imports or to limit imports, and there's an objective for it. Or it has to do with what kind of fuels that we use to power our economy. Are we looking at renewable energy, or are we still going to be relying on fossil fuels? Now, that change, usually the process of change is not really that easy. For instance, there are theories that talk about what we call the policy window. So what that says is that for you to make a change in the policy system, a certain window has to open, the opportunity has to come. It is not something that happens all the time. Sometimes you have one crisis or a shift in public opinion, or there's a change in government. Then you have an opportunity to change the agenda or to change and to cause reform. So you must understand that you must look out for where the opportunities are. But then policy making also can be seen as a power struggle between different coalitions that have differing core beliefs. And it's important for you to find the coalition whose core beliefs identify with yours.
Right.
And to rally with that coalition, to learn from that coalition, to contribute to what that coalition is doing. Because when that window of opportunity opens to change policy or to transform policy, what happens is that the coalition that is best prepared for that moment, that has built resources, that has, that's
the research,
yes,
the data,
is best positioned to take advantage of that window. So that's really how you do it. You have to engage, even if the opportunity for change hasn't yet opened, you still have to continue to engage, to learn, to discuss, to contribute to the conversations around the policy.
Yeah.
If you do that, you stand a very good chance of achieving results that are closer to your core beliefs and your core objectives.
Yeah. Prof, I'm hearing Amara say that, and I'm thinking, as a Nigerian, and I'm saying, well, who taught me about policy, right? So let's talk a little bit about policy education. At what point was I supposed to learn about policy? Was I supposed to know I'm supposed to engage in the process? I'm supposed to be aware. I'm supposed to be part of coalitions. Who taught me this? In primary school? Where did I learn this as a Nigerian?
It's a really good question. And the question that you asked before is also linked to that. How does the average citizen get involved in policy?
Yes.
I think the first thing to really ask is, why should we get involved in policy? Because the thing is this, public policy affects all of us.
Yes.
It affects our today and it affects our tomorrow.
This is correct.
So we leave it to the elite, like you said, elite capture, at our own peril. Whether we like it or not, at every single level, policies are affecting our daily lives.
That's right.
And they condition the kind of future we can have, and even the opportunities our children will have. So we need to take an interest, number one, take an interest in policy. Now, how do we even begin? I often tell people, get involved in the area of your passion. What are you passionate about? What is the area of your own sphere of influence, or your job, your studies? What area actually interests you? For example, if you're an educator, you need to know about the national policy on education. What is it saying to you? Do you agree with everything that it says? Does it align with your experience and your needs?
Right.
Form or become a part of an interest group that is involved or actively engaged in the policy dialogue, policy discourse, policy action space. Now, there are also opportunities out there in the policy process that citizens can take advantage of. For example, public hearings. The National Assembly holds public hearings. And very often we just say, they are just talking to themselves.
But to access the National Assembly is not easy.
No, when it's public hearings, they are open to the general public. They are open, and they announce these public hearings. Anybody can walk in there, sit and listen at these public hearings. And then sometimes they invite a memoranda from the general public. For example, now they're looking at reviewing the national constitution.
Yes.
So you can join a group. For example, I'm very much interested in gender-based violence, gender policy. So I'm part of a group that is speaking to what we want, what changes we want in the constitution. So get involved. And then, like I said, local government. At the local government level, are we part of our local government? You know, what the local government is doing? Are we asking questions? What's the budget? Nowadays, most local governments have local government development plans.
Yes.
Those are policies. How are those local government development plans aligned with your own interests, your own needs in your local government? So I think first taking an interest, understanding that we are all affected. And number two, getting to know the space, know the policies that affect your job, affect, you know, your children, or affect, you know, just the space that you operate. And then going on from there, becoming part of other interest groups so that we form a collective pressure point on government, compelling government to change and to do things the right way.
Fantastic. Please give her a round of applause. All right, so Amara, let's start to talk about some of the critical factors that can aid effective policy making. And one of the things that comes to my mind, this is the leading woman show, is, you know, is our policy process even inclusive? Or is the environment inclusive? So let's start to talk, what are the critical success factors for effective policy making?
First of all, I mean, to just build on what Prof said earlier, one of the ways to improve engagement or education around policy is to help people connect what they do on an everyday basis to policy making, because it's not that different. We engage in policy making all the time as human beings. I mean, we make collective decisions about things. If you live in an estate or a shared service area, you've engaged in policy making before. You might actually even be actively involved in policy making. So for instance, when the diesel prices suddenly spiked a year ago as a result of the war in Ukraine, several communities came together and said, we can't be running generator the way we used to. We have to now agree. When do we turn on the generator? When do we turn it off? That's policy. It's a collective resource. We're agreeing, how do we solve this energy problem? Because we've identified a problem and we've identified goals. That's policy making. You know, you also come together when you have security challenges. You say, how do we collectively solve these security challenges? Do we contribute money to get security agents at our gate? Do we reinforce the fences? Do we put electric fence somewhere or barbed wires? Do we install surveillance cameras? These are collective decisions. This is policy making at the community level. And if you can extend that to doing it at a local government level, to getting involved with the institutions and the mechanisms for managing collective resources at local government, for instance, you've actually engaged in policy making. Now, the critical success factors for policy making is engagement, consultation, you know, the fact that there has to be that level of consultation. Prof has said stuff about research, that it has to be evidence-driven. You have to understand what the problem, because if you don't understand the problem, you can't solve it. And I have to say something here. It's not just an empirical understanding that is just data of, you know, the problems, because sometimes we get too driven by just the numbers. There's also an understanding of the values around the problem. That wouldn't reflect in data, but it's also critical because there are, you know, like she said, Nigeria is a complex society.
It is.
And there are socio-cultural norms that you can't measure with data, but they kind of govern our behavior. And so you also have to understand that, and you have to design the policy to be compatible with these norms, or else what would happen is you would have what we call an enforcement problem, because the social groupings or the groups that hold those values will resist the implementation of the policy. And I know, giving this example, a lot of Nigerians would think I remember lots of policies that you had lots of resistance to because it offended a certain section of the population.
All right.
So it's important that you are aware of the values or the value systems around where you are You are implementing
just beyond
the
the quantitative data.
Yes. Another thing that she mentioned, which I want to repeat, is the strength of institutions, the capacity of institutions, because institutions are the mechanisms through which policy implementation happens. And if these institutions are weak, then you can't implement policy. And you can only implement policy to the extent to which those institutions can reach. Beyond where the institutions, if you want to implement beyond the institutions, then you have, challenges. But apart from that, they become custodians of what we call the rules of the game. So when you want policies to stick, like when government changes or circumstances changes, you still want the policy to continue, which is a challenge we have, that there's policy somersaults. Strong institutions can hold and sustain policy. So that's also a critical factor.
Fantastic. So, Prof, what are you going to add to we're building a toolkit on what are those critical success factors for effective policy making?
I think just to add to what he said, we also need a very strong and responsive governance culture. That is a culture where leadership is seen as power held in the interest of the public. A commitment to governance on behalf of the people that shows that we really do know that whatever resources we manage, we must manage them responsibly and sustainably. Not just for the present, but also for the future. And, I apologize because earlier when you spoke about political education, I forgot to mention that it has to begin at primary level.
Absolutely.
And back to governance, we need to begin to teach governance and leadership right in the primary level, because policy is a function of governance and leadership. And so when we begin to teach it as a compulsory topic at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, people now will become used to it, and it will be a natural thing. They will not feel alienated or awkward when it comes to getting involved in policy.
I would also like you to speak a little bit about inclusion in the process, because you just said that it should be representative. But where you have people in decision making who are not representative of the collective, then there's a gap there, isn't there?
Especially for vulnerable groups. People in the rural areas, income poor people, people with disabilities, women and young people, and minorities generally. We need to be intentional, deliberate, and use tools for including them. So, for example, the National Gender Policy has what we call a GESI framework. That means gender equality, empowerment, and social inclusion. So across the broad spectrum of society, you have to be deliberate and intentional, reaching people who ordinarily would not have a voice in the policy process. So policy and governance must give voice and visibility to people who are ordinarily excluded and far or distant from the policy-making process.
Voice and visibility. I love it. It's time for us to take another break. And when we return, we'll take some audience questions. Great. So let's take some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot from this session. So what do you think is responsible for the lack of enough media coverage on policy matters?
That's very interesting. Amara, I'm going to have you take that one. I don't know if you heard her question. What is the reason for lack of media coverage? And there's not enough media coverage of policies. What would you say about that?
Well, there's several reasons. The first is a lack of transparency. There's just not enough information for you to write a story. There's also the lack of interest. Media companies are also profit-making organizations, and they have a limited real estate to cover. And so they want to put in stuff there that people actually want to read. So again, that's also a factor. There's also certain policies that are special interest policies, and therefore maybe the newspaper is not interested in promoting the conversation about that policy, and so you will find that there will be limited coverage about that. Again, you have that there are certain situations where there's a deliberate effort to limit coverage around policy. And so the communication around the policy is targeted not necessarily at the general public, people who are paying attention to media, but to specific groups of people. So that could also be an issue.
Yes. Okay, great. Let's take another question.
Thank you so much. I'm learning so much about policies. What measure do you think can be put in place to keep the government accountable on policies being made? Thank you.
Interesting. Prof, do you want to take that one and, maybe highlight a bit more on measurements and accountability?
The measures to be put in place to keep government accountable. I think the first one goes back to the issue of having strong institutions. We need to give more power, more strength to compliance institutions. Right now in Nigeria, law enforcement is very weak. So even when policies are not being implemented, nobody is holding anybody accountable. So I think, like some years back, we went to, when I say we NIPS, we traveled to France, and we're looking at their education policy and policy on how they get things done. And they said that one thing that they've started doing is to get the citizens to vote on the effectiveness of policies. And then they now have a scorecard to score individual ministries, departments, and agencies on how they've performed. And there are penalties, for ministries that don't perform. So you have an incentive, a sanction, and a reward system. So we need to put in place that kind of incentive, sanction, and reward system, where when you don't perform, there are actually clear penalties, and people can see those penalties. And then, of course, strengthening those law enforcement agencies that are responsible for oversight, okay? And then citizen involvement, citizen participation, which is the strongest aspect. A lot of citizens, and it goes back to the first question that the lady over there asked about why there's not enough media coverage. A lot of it has to do with language. Because we don't break down these policies into our local dialects, into even pidgin. If we begin the young policy for local language, people go, they get involved now. You understand? Those kind of things, people will take an interest and say, this thing now
what did they talk with this?
What did they get? So I think language is, huge.
It's a barrier as well.
It is a barrier, and it needs to be opened up. It can be a medium for greater exchange, and then people will now begin to hold people accountable. Now, in the UK, for example, there are places you can go to. They call them citizens' bureau. You can go and make public complaint. You can go and find out what the policy is and make a public complaint. And those complaints are independently gathered and sent to the organization that you want to get involved in. And I think we need to know more about the Public Complaints Commission of Nigeria, because the Public Complaints Commission is one of the institutions that needs to be strengthened, so that people can actually lodge complaints about poor services, poor goods, and what have you. So as some of these institutions are not functioning the way they should, and they need to be strengthened.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad that we got to hear from our audience and answer some of their questions. Now we'll see what some Nigerians out there have to say before we take closing remarks from our guests.
Laws, rules, regulation, a set of regulation for a particular group of people.
To me, is when you are his policy, women is to have power for everything we are doing.
Maybe things, laws, and statements that people pass out for people to follow and people to know about.
Let's start practice. Free education. When patients come in case of emergency, why don't you treat them first? School and online.
My school and friends.
That should be social media, Instagram, Twitter, and the likes.
I'll say social media.
For example, like public policy, the government's policy that is affecting students and all. So we see it from our school platforms.
So many important points have been highlighted in this episode. Now, to bring our conversation to a close, let's hear final thoughts from our guests. And I want to start with, Prof, let's start with you.
Okay. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think just to, inform our audience that we all have a stake in the public policy process. And it is really in our interest to get actively involved, to teach ourselves, to learn about what policy is all about, and to try and key into the process. I also want to inform us that at the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, where I work, we observe that there's a huge gap in terms of media coverage. So we now have what we call NIPS Policy TV. And it is meant to inform the public about policies, discuss relevant policies in different sectors, and help people to understand. It's on NTA 24 on, I think, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. I've forgotten the time. I'll try and let you know. Yes. But I think it's 11 a.m. Yeah. So we have that, and it's a good place to start.
Fantastic. Great. Give her a round of applause. Free information about where you can access policy. Amara, what would be your final thoughts?
Well, I would say I would go back to what I said at the beginning about policy being a collective decision. And to emphasize that collective, they say that if you want to travel fast, travel alone. But if you want to go far,
go together.
Go as a collective, go as a group. And Nigeria has become a society where we're very individualistic. And perhaps maybe we're not to blame, because for some reason we happen to be our own security.
On your own.
We are, we happen to be our own energy provider.
Yeah.
We happen to be our own health insurance. We happen to be our own plumber. So there's a tendency for us to believe that we can do governance by ourselves. But it doesn't work. I think we need to invest in social cohesion.
Yes.
It's important that we have a sense of community, a sense of collective, because without that sense of the collective, it's very difficult for policy to work. Even policy engagement is hard when people are focused on just themselves and on their own issues.
Yes.
We have to begin to see collective problems. We have to begin to contribute to collective solutions.
Right.
You might fix the problem for yourself with a workaround very quickly, but if it is going to last generations, if it's going to fix the problem so you don't have to worry about it and you can sleep with your eyes closed, it has to be a collective solution. Everybody has to be involved. So I would say this, that we should support whole of society approaches to solving problems, because that's how we get better at policy making. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wow. I have to say that our guest had the huge task of demystifying policy on our first episode, and it has been such an insightful episode and conversation today. Would like to say a big thank you to our guests, Professor Funmi Para Malam MNI. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And to Amara Mwankwa as well, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
To our audience, thank you for being such a valuable part of today's discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media to share your thoughts on the episode using the hashtag on your screen. I'm Abosede Jojagan. Remember, women's leadership can change everything, everywhere. See you next week.